Okay, then I guess we will open up the discussion on the MBTA communities. So we had our presentation last time from Rachel. And there were two proposals, one concentrating everything down by the so-called Waltham Corner corridor, and the other one splitting it between Waltham Corner and center of town. And do we have any more information that's come in since then, Rachel, or are we just still trying to come to a consensus on what the board's sort of leanings are?
Yeah, so I know it was a lot of information at that last meeting. So there were not many questions. I think Mr. Immonen had submitted some pretty good questions that will be answered depending on what the board recommends as these overlay areas. So some of the numbers will change depending on which way you go. And so that's really what the board needs to sort of narrow down or pin down as of right now as to which option they want to go towards. So that way the numbers I can finalize those for you. And it's honestly, it's maybe two different numbers. Nothing is going to drastically change from what was presented in that as option 2. I think we had it as option 2 in that presentation. If you do just the wampum one. Again,
that's what I remember us leaning toward, but shouldn't take us long, I would think, to sort out one or the other.
Right.
And
actually,
we'd like to have the chairman here for that final conversation and vote.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to make any kind of a vote on it tonight. Rachel and you and I had been discussing sort of the working group. I don't know if that's something we want to discuss at this juncture of the hearing, or
yeah, I think we can set the the select board chair reached out to members of the planning board, economic development, and his own board to come up with a working group. And I think it was decided the date on that was February 27th. So the planning board is going to have to create a subcommittee. I think a few of you were able to attend. You'll have to, for the explicit purpose of meeting, those 3 members meeting at that February 27th at 7 p.m. via Zoom. I think it's 7. And then to report back at the March 6th meeting. Brian, you can tell me if my wording is wrong.
Thank you, Rachel, and I hope you saw me nodding my head in the affirmative. So I was just making sure we checked the boxes for creating and then charging the subcommittee, and you checked the boxes. You covered the 3 things you needed to do.
So I know that I was one of the people. Who were the other 2?
Chuck and Mike.
Okay. So we can take a vote here tonight.
You need a motion to create a subcommittee.
To create the subcommittee and to charge it with just that particular function, right?
Correct. And then appoint those 3 members to that subcommittee.
All right, so I'll move to do all that.
Okay, we have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion, we have a second. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, roll call vote, Mr. Cass,
Aye.
Mr. English,
Aye. So I see
Mr.
that,
Lawrence.
Aye. Seems like Bill's audio's working.
I thought it was at Woodstock for a second. Mr. Skinner,
aye.
Mr. Rin,
I'm gonna say aye, but you have a guy with his hand up. I don't know if you noticed that.
yeah, well, I will get to that. We wanted to just establish this working group first, and then
Okay,
we'll go to comments. Okay,
Aye.
Charles Woodham's aye. 6 in favor, none opposed, 1 absent. So we have our subcommittee. We will be meeting February 27th, which is next Tuesday. Via Zoom. I'm sure Rachel will get us the information on.
Yep,
The-
I'll post
on-
the meeting, the agenda for that subcommittee, tomorrow. I'll also include it in the notifications, your email newsletter, email blast as well. So whoever subscribes to the planning board agenda, can also get that. I didn't know if the board had any questions about last week, if you want some more information. It was a lot, if you want to go over the bylaw, the language, what you want to do tonight. Or just take public comment and then we can respond to that either tonight or at the March 6th meeting.
Okay.
Actually,
Well,
Chuck,
we'll go down-
before you take public comment, I just wanted to, I looked over that stuff and I know Jim was saying, he was maybe in favor of Crosby Valve. I'm sorry, Jim, if I got that. I mean, you were in favor of down by 495. If I have that wrong, I'm sorry. But I think we'd be better off putting half of it at Crosby Valve and the other part at the sliver, down by 495. Because first of all, that would help the downtown so much more. You're going to have so many more people. Rachel, do they still have that shuttle to Norfolk? They don't anymore. Hey, if we're
No.
going to do this MBTA thing, they should get the shuttle back.
Yep.
If we're going to bend over backwards for this, we should get something back. And if you,
we're
if you
going
put,
to get something back, all right.
yeah, I know, I know.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm embarrassed to say I went to high school with Charlie Baker, so that's a whole different issue. But if we put all the housing down by 495, somebody is still going to end up developing Crosby Valve, and that could add another 400 or 500 units. So now you're up to like 1,200 between the two. So, but if you put it at Crosby Valve and then a sliver down by 495, who knows what they'll do with that other sliver? I bet it won't be multi, 3 families, 2 families, or whatever. Maybe it's going to be single families. But I would lean more to Crosby Valve and the other sliver.
The only thing that I got it, and thanks for your input. Okay, because obviously this, the subcommittee will talk about this, but I thought the sliver was going to be the same size either way. So why add Crosby Valve onto it? That was kind of how I was looking at it.
No, but I don't think somebody will put multifamilies, another one. Somebody is definitely going to develop Crosby Valve one way or another. It will be developed. So if you put the 750 down by 495, they're still going to develop Crosby Valve. I'm trying to keep the amount of units down to 750 instead of 1,200. I'm getting to 1,200,
Rachel,
Jim, because 750 on the MBTA community, if it's down by 495.
No, I
And then
understand what you're saying.
somebody's going to develop Crosby.
Maybe I had a complete misunderstanding. I thought you said, Rachel, that the developing inside these areas is still subject to our current bylaws and everything. No?
So-
Not really.
Okay, all right, good.
No, so
Then
the
that's why-
MBT So the MBTA communities is an overlay district.
Right,
So all the underlying uses are still allowed.
okay. And
If
these are
somebody
now
want-
additionally allowed.
Correct. And if
Okay.
somebody wants to do those things that are in this overlay district, those then become as of right
Right,
with a site plan approval from the planning board.
okay.
So Rachel, if we were to split it between the center of town and the 495 area, the board would lose a fair amount of control over what gets put in the center of town because it
Correct.
is now falling under that MBTA overlay. So, right now, that area is what, 8 units per acre, I think. But if we make that part of the MBTA overlay, we lose that control, right? And could they increase the density in that
15
area
units an
if
acre
we
or
do that?
something, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
So,
15 units an acre,
15 per acre, right?
correct.
And we lose the ability to control that by special permit.
And if you wanted to keep the 8 units per acre density in the downtown, that then means that whatever's left over needs to be at a higher density in order to get that average of
To the
15
average of
units
the
per
15,
acre.
right? Because you had said, I think we'd have to, the 495 district would have to be 22 units per acre to make up for the fact that the center of town has a lower density. So,
Actually, that wouldn't bother me as much. I'm trying to eliminate an extra 400 units.
but I understand and appreciate what you're saying, Bob. I just not sure that there's any guarantee that that's going to do that.
It's true.
And so if you take a look at the zone, that's the Wampum 495, if you turn on the aerial mapping and you look to see what's there, a lot of those parcels are already developed, either single family home or existing multifamily, condos, multifamily housing or multiple attached dwellings, condos. There's probably about, I think it's maybe about 25, 27 acres that's undeveloped right now. That could potentially, be developed. The rest is all, again, single family homes, a farm, and yeah, existing multifamily housing.
Yeah, but if you own a single family home down there and it's worth X, and some
again-
developer comes along and says, I'll give you 3X because I can make 20X by redeveloping your parcel, that's a tough thing to say no to for some people. So the fact that there's a home there doesn't really mean all that much in terms of what can and can't be done.
Understood. Just again, sort of stating that there's
No,
existing
I
uses
point
there.
taken. I mean, it feels like it's very developed out down there, but we've seen some in the case of the 40Bs and some other thing. I mean, when the end numbers show up, the beginning numbers start to change, and that can matter for people, and it's worth their while. So anyway.
Chuck, we still, a monkey wrench landed since our last meeting with Milton, who seems to be running interference on this demand.
Right.
And two things that I'd like to understand: what would the actual financial negative impact to Wrentham be if we don't do this? And then watch to see what evolves with Milton as time goes on here.
I would say directly, we'd lose the $171,000 that we just were awarded for the online permitting. We'd lose $75,000 for zoning updates. We'd lose $70,000 for a downtown wastewater feasibility study. Those are just the studies that are in my office. There's a bunch of others that I just got from the accountant today that was gonna look to see what could possibly, which ones are active. In other, like the Council on Aging, if they have any, or the schools, if they have any, or fire, police, to see which ones could be affected. As you may or may not know, but we recently, or last year, we had Red Dam inspected. It's required to be inspected, every 5 to 10 years, I think it is, because it's a high hazard, 5 years dam. So that means if it goes, there's a high hazard of it taking out a lot. And the state came back, the inspection came back and saying that it has to be updated, so rebuilt. That's how is the town going to pay for that? We were going to look at a dams and seawalls grant, which is the grant that was just taken away by Milton, by the state from Milton. So this would have, immediate ramifications on long-term planning that not only my office is doing, but other, for capital improvements that we don't readily know the ramifications of. It's not just the three bills or the 3 grants that were named in the law. It's those 10 other ones that, I noted in that last presentation that we would be ineligible for. The MS4 requirements. We have certain requirements that we're supposed to do every year for reporting. Brian and I, the DPW and I use, MVP grants for that. We would not be eligible for those anymore, which then could cause the EPA to come in and say, well, now, we're going to fine you. So there's a lot of unknowns, ramifications that could be seen. Brian, I don't know if you're seeing anything more.
No, and I'm glad that you use the word unknowns, because that's the part I wanted to chime in on. This is a bit untested, and so, Milton is elected, no pun intended, to go first. And so we're seeing the state's reaction, and there were a lot of articles today about that. But there's an entire, different piece to the puzzle that we haven't seen, and that's the Attorney General and what they're going to do. They've made promises about, actions they may take and what Attorney General Campbell may do. We just haven't seen them do it yet, but I have no doubt they're working on it. And there's a third category too, which is I've heard, chatter in other communities that are watching Milton just the way we are, and they're saying, well, why don't we do what they're doing? And so there's a third possibility that if pulling the funding doesn't incentivize towns enough to comply, if a lawsuit from the Attorney General doesn't incentivize towns enough to comply, well, what's the third option? And that's they'll revise the MBTA Communities Act and just remove our discretion from it. And so it could be imposed. So we don't know how far the state's willing to go, but every indication that I've seen says they're willing to go as far as it takes. And so one of the questions that came out at the last session was what other sources of state aid might get folded in to this, and we don't know the answer to that. There are first we started with 3, and then that's been expanded to a greater list. What if that list keeps expanding? The one that was asked, I think, was Chapter 90 funds. What if Chapter 90 funds come into this, and so on and so forth? So I imagine that, the more communities start to push back, the more the state will be inclined to reciprocate and raise the stakes. And so that is a huge unknown and difficult to quantify. So just be aware that we know, I hate to, get Donald Rumsfeld on this, but there are known knowns and unknown unknowns. And so the unknown unknowns are the ones I'm concerned about. we can quantify the knowns and a few of the sort of unknown knowns, but after that, it's anybody's guess. And I don't think it's necessarily a prudent game to play to ask the state, well, what's the worst you can do? Usually we don't like the answer to that question. So at any rate, I just wanted to chime in on that last point. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Yeah, yeah, because on top of all the grant money that that we would lose out on, you're right. They're playing for keeps, and they've got much more in the way of resources. You know, if the Attorney General decides they want to sue every municipality that doesn't comply, that means now the town, on top of the money that we lose in all the grants, we're now having to defend a lawsuit from the state that can afford the cost of the lawsuits a lot better than our town can.
Well, they just have more leverage in so many areas.
Right, exactly. I was discussing this with somebody over the weekend, and I said, it's sort of, there's a bus coming down the road, and we can either try to steer it or we can get run over by it, but we can't stop it. The state's not going to stop this. They're not going to decide, you know, if a couple of towns vote against it, that, oh yeah, maybe we were wrong. But one thing that we do have to keep in mind, or that we should keep in mind through this whole process, is, you know, the Miltons of the world are probably not going to be very numerous. But there's nothing that says if the town goes ahead and approves whatever form of this, you know, we choose to do, that if, you know, the case of Milton plays out and it goes to court and the court sides with Milton, then that means that there's nothing to keep us from going back and having another vote and voting to eliminate the overlay districts if things work out that way. But I think we're in danger if we try to come from the different perspective, you know, the approach of trying to block it from the beginning. I think we stand to put the town in great harm if this doesn't get adopted in one form or another.
We have this gentleman who still has his hand raised.
Yeah, I'll get to that. I just want to make sure that, see if anybody else on the board has any other questions, need any other information from Rachel before we go to that. And obviously we'll have the working committee, we'll meet next Tuesday, and then we'll come back on presumably March 6th to discuss what happens at that meeting. So rather than going around the board, anybody else on the board have any other questions or comments that they want before we go to public input? Okay, hearing none. See, Andrew Gordon has his hand raised.
Thank you so much. I was just wanted to ask a question as a follow-up from the last meeting. I know we had gone through the presentation about different properties, and one of the properties that was part of the consideration set was on Route 1. And that seemed to be over by other existing residential areas that also had areas near city centers and accommodations. And it also is near major throughways of Route 1 and 495. So just as we were considering different options, I know we had narrowed down to those two, but I was just wondering if that was a potential option that maybe didn't add people close to the center of town that would be reasonable with some of the concerns that have been raised tonight. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. I know Rachel, that was one of the areas that you had looked at when trying to come up with these, and what, if you could just go back over what the reasoning was for not considering that area as being a sort of a best choice.
Yeah, so, again, MBTA communities, Wrentham is an adjacent community. And so we have different sort of requirements when looking to site these zones, because we can't be within a half mile of a commuter rail station because one doesn't exist. So in that case, they want it to be near areas of existing, downtowns, neighborhood businesses. And so that's why the Wampum area was sort of chosen, because you're near the Wampum corner, which is an existing neighborhood business, and you're also near, 495 and some other, retail centers and some other underutilized properties. I'm talking about the former KOA site as well, that was built and never been developed except for Amazon.
That makes perfect sense. And I think that seemed like it was a great option with it. I was just saying that the Route 1 site seemed that it could be a part of the consideration set based on the qualifications of the MBTA communities, where it said it needed to be near existing facilities and existing city centers where people are living. It seemed that it could qualify under those. So it just seemed like it could be part of the consideration set. I wasn't saying the other one shouldn't be a part of the consideration set at all or anything like that.
No, yeah, and I was just explaining why one over the other. Also, the Wampum area has the benefit of being, close to a, state park, some open space, as well as the hopefully future Metacomet Greenway that'll connect the 6 towns, from Walpole all the way to North Attleboro. So there's also that piece too. When you're trying to look at meeting all the guidelines of the MBTA communities, good for families, providing more access, pedestrian, different, modalities, pedestrian bikes, ways of getting
Route
around.
1 is not very family friendly at this point down in that area.
No.
Yep. Understood.
So I know, so Andrew had his hand up, but then Michelle Roush sent a chat and she can't raise her hand. And then Leo after Michelle Rouse. Sorry if I say it wrong.
Okay.
Thank
Michelle,
you,
you have the
Rachel.
floor.
Thank you. It's Michelle Rouse, but thank you. It's a pleasure being a part of your planning board meeting and obviously listening to the importance of this MBTA. And I'm looking forward to the working session next week. A couple of things I'd like to get some clarification on. Rachel, you presented your slides that were on social media in this meeting, as well as the select board meeting, in the particular grants that would be affected if we did not comply. It seems like tonight we're adding in a lot of other unknowns and other grants that are being thrown out there. And I'm not sure which is true, because one was said on a presentation and now there seems to be more that are added to that. I understand Brian's point of view in terms of what's happening in Milton. I've spoken to members of the grassroots group in Milton, as well as their planning board, understanding what's happening there. I don't want us to forget that this is an unfunded mandate. So yes, we may be losing grants, but the amount of impact financially to our infrastructure, our schools, our fire, our police, our traffic is going to be very, very large. So as we're discussing and thinking of compromises and what's going to work best, I think we all have to keep that in the forefront, as well as this is somewhat, or is considered unconstitutional, what is being done by the state in mandating this to every town. The other thing I just want to tag on to what Andrew said, I think he's got a great point in the consideration of the Route 1. I don't see a big difference between the parcel of 495 being close to the downtown sidewalks that's also being proposed. 495 is close to a state park. It's close to 495, 95 Patriots Place. It has more retail. It has more options for food and so forth than our downtown. So I think that we need to give a little bit more consideration and not quickly put something off to the side because we feel like it doesn't have the downtown feel that is being requested by the MTA requirements. And lastly,
So
I
sorry,
think that
yeah,
lastly, I think that we're looking at what Milton's doing, but there are a lot of other towns that are doing some work on this. And I'm sure, Brian, you could jump in here as well, but I know that Rockport has filed a lawsuit against the state for this being unconstitutional. Holden, obviously, we're well aware of the legal suit that they won. Middletown is looking to do action as it relates to this. So towns are looking at other ways to handle this. We may not be saying absolutely no, but if we are, we might have to look for other compromises with the state, and adding this many units and individuals to this charm and this community could change Wrentham for generations. Forever it will change it. So just keep those things in mind as we continue to work through this. Again, I'm really looking forward to working with the subcommittee next Tuesday, and I really appreciate the time to be able to share some of my thoughts as a resident and a select board member. Thank you.
Thank you. Rachel, did you have something that you wanted to?
I didn't know if there was a question that needed to be answered. I think the one I heard was about, I presented a certain set of grants at one meeting that's on the social media, but then I'm also talking about new grants now. Which is it? As we talked about, this is an ever evolving situation. So we just found out with the Milton case that the state is taking dams and seawalls grants. There's a lot of unknowns as to where this could be. There's a lot of discretionary grants that are out there. There are a lot of state grants that are out there that the state could, hold us, ineligible for. So next time I present it, I could give you two more. It is an evolving situation. The ones on that list are still the ones that we could put, they've already said that we've could not be eligible for, along with the 3 that are named in the law. Again, it's evolving, so I don't have a definitive answer.
Okay.
May
Thank
I
you, Rachel.
just briefly second what, if it's okay, with the
Please,
chair?
yes, please go ahead.
Just a second what Rachel just said. That's accurate. I mean, there are a lot of unknowns here, and so we're learning new things as we go along, and as we get more information in terms of how the state is reacting to developments, we're learning those too. They're hard to forecast. And just a sort of point of clarification with respect to the Holden case and the Rockport case, those were essentially citizens groups, 10 taxpayer suits. The Holden one, the town didn't. I mean, to say that the town won, it is, I guess in a sense accurate, but also it was dismissed because the court found that the plaintiffs group didn't have standing, and they couldn't show that they were people or persons aggrieved, and so it was dismissed on procedural grounds. So that case doesn't stand for the proposition that Holden sort of beat the state on this issue. The case really hasn't been tried yet. The merits of these claims haven't been adjudicated by any court, and we've yet to see a case where the Attorney General, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, is a plaintiff. And so that may be coming. We may see that maybe in Milton, maybe in another one of these communities. But the ones that we've seen filed by citizens groups, aren't really the same thing. And so I'm just offering that as a word of caution because I don't want to read too much into those. That's not the same thing as getting sued by the Attorney General. And so they've made, or Attorney General Campbell has made statements in the paper and in a lot of written advisories that have been sent to communities, and to lawyers associations, as planners associations and others, about what their plans are. And those are some pretty big plans to sue under the Fair Housing Act, anti-discrimination laws. Those lawsuits not only carry financial penalties, but attorney's fees and costs and triple damages. And so, yeah, those can take years to go through the courts, and they're murky and they have difficult standards that need to be proved. But that's a pretty big deal. And so, especially if it's brought by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so those two cases aren't the same. And so I just wanted to make that clarification for everybody's benefit.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate the input on that. I knew that the Holden thing wasn't a direct, sort of apples to apples as far as state versus the town. So thank you for clarifying that. Rachel and I were discussing last night briefly the fact that the state's taken this long to finally come up with its requirements. That was partially by design, because they floated out there that this was coming down the pike, and then they wanted to, I think they heard some of the commentary and pushback from some of the municipalities. Well, because I remember when we first heard about it, the first thing I said was, well, fine, why don't we designate the development center? It's already state land. They can do whatever they want. They can they want the housing built, they can build it on their land. So then the state turned around and said, oh, you can't use state land. Not unless you get previous, prior approval from the state to designate their land, which is not going to happen. State wants to control it. And they've just waited, and they've heard where towns might want to try to do battle with them, and they've altered the law accordingly. And there's no reason to think that they won't just keep doing that, because they're bound and determined to make this happen. We could set the town up for financial ruin if it got to that point. And I've lived in this town my whole life. I've watched this town change already without this. Nobody hates this more than I do. But I'm also a realist and realize that to say it's an uphill battle is an understatement. Mr. Imminent had his hand raised.
Thank you, Mr. Woodhams. As you heard me 2 weeks ago, I am in support of passing this bylaw. And I spent several years on the zoning board, so I've had a lot of experience reading the bylaw and working with it. So my questions pretty much are directed towards getting this bylaw as good as possible, so that when it goes to town meeting, it has a higher chance of passing. One thing I would oppose putting this MBTA units in the Crosby valve position. The primary reason for that is several years ago, town meeting approved a multi-use overload district for that, which has controls for the planning board when approving it. To me, it would be a real kick in the butt for the members of town meeting to have an MBTA community go in there without our controls and have extremely dense housing in a place which I thought was going to be a multi-use district. So I don't think that would be the best strategy going forward in terms of getting this passed by town meeting. Next thing is, I read through the districts, and I agree that having it only at one corner makes a whole lot of sense. However, one question did show up. I noticed that's in the R43 zoning district. In the R43 zoning district, the backyard setback is 40 feet, and it's being converted to 25 feet in this district. And I was wondering, what was the rationale for that? I'm concerned because one part of that district abuts the state forest. And to me, having as much space between the homes and the state forest is advisable. I was wondering, was it simply because you needed to get that area in order to get the density? But that's something I was curious about. Now, maybe I should just throw all my questions, and you guys can discuss this either tonight or at your meeting, workings district Tuesday. Another thing, I like the idea that you're requiring a EV charging spot for every 20 parking spots. I think that's proactive. It makes a whole lot of sense. clearly the direction the state and the nation is to go ahead and allow for conversion to electric vehicles. Also, I was a little bit confused with the wording at one place. It says, what is the minimum open space requirement? I'm really concerned about the word minimum. When I think of minimum, I think of square feet, some area and so forth. But later on, I saw it seemed like it was saying it was meaning that in the front yard, you had to go ahead and have it manicured or natural. And so I just found that word, if that's the case, I find the word minimum a little bit confusing. And also in the affordability requirements in section D, it has a comment about applicable projects have to do certain things. And my question was, what constitutes an applicable project? I didn't happen to see where that was defined somewhere else. I may have missed that, but that was a question I had when I read through it. And my last question was, in the affordability requirements in section E, it says that the money will go into Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And I was wondering, do we in Wrentham actually have such a trust fund, or is that something that's going to be created? I also sit on the Community Preservation Committee, and one of our mandates is to look at housing. So I would like to know if that's something that does exist, and is it something that can be leveraged in other situations? So I make these comments primarily because I like this to be passed, and I'd like you to go ahead and make it as clear as possible. I find it very frustrating sitting on the zoning board having bylaws and have ambiguity and not having any idea what people actually meant. So if you look at those phrases, I would appreciate it. Thank you very much, Mr. Woodhams and members of the planning board.
Thank you, Mr. Rimmon. I appreciate your comments. Rachel, I don't know if you want to address any of those now, or do we want to sort of put those together and discuss them on in the working group on Tuesday?
Yeah, we can discuss them in the working group, and then on the March 6th, I can include that in there. And Leo also did send an email, so I appreciate, I always appreciate a second set of eyes on these things, too. So thank you for finding that.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else from the public wish to speak on this? Please raise your hand. I'm not seeing anybody, Rachel. Are you seeing anyone?
I see no hands up and nothing in the chat.
Okay. Anything else from any members of the board? Any comments based on some of the things that you've heard this evening? All right. So given that we have no more comments, no more requests for input from the audience, I would entertain a motion to continue this public hearing to our next meeting on March 6th, 7:15.
So
So
moved.
moved.
Second.
Second.
We have a motion, we have a second. Roll call vote, Mr. Cass,
Aye.
Mr. English,
Aye.
Mr. Lawrence,
Aye.
Mr. Skinner,
Aye.
Mr. Rin,
Aye.
Charles Woodhams, aye. 6 in favor, none opposed, 1 absent. We are continued till March 6th at 7:15, and the working group will be meeting next Tuesday, and we'll report our findings at that meeting.